All that will come up. We are prepared for that. We have a thick skin, and we know that people will judge him and people will call names, and they don't give him enough credit. From June that he announced,
Melania Trump expected a charming royal tour, but what she uncovered inside Queen Camilla's doll's house was nothing short of scandalous. Hidden in plain sight were secrets so startling, they left Melania visibly shaken. Her expression said it all. Whispers of betrayal, power, and untold truths seemed to echo from every tiny room.
Lucky enough to spend precious time each year in Aberdeenshire. And finally, because 10 years ago, I received the great honour of being installed as Chancellor of this very special university.
Behind the tiny doors and delicate walls was a secret so explosive, it stopped Melania in her tracks. When Melania Trump stepped out onto the grounds of Windsor Castle alongside Queen Camilla, it was more than just another polite royal engagement. This was part of a tightly choreographed state visit, one that had been marked on the calendar months in advance. The occasion was Donald Trump's second state visit to the United Kingdom as former President of the United States. And though most of the headlines naturally revolved around political talks and diplomatic protocols, this particular moment drew attention for an entirely different reason. It was not about speeches or negotiations. It was about two women, one American and one British, sharing a quiet tour through one of the most historic residences in the world. The setting itself mattered. Windsor Castle has stood for nearly 1,000 years, a fortress and a home that has housed monarchs from William the Conqueror through to the present reign of King Charles III. It is not only an architectural symbol, but also a living stage where traditions meet modernity. When Queen Camilla and Melania entered its walls together, they were stepping into history that most visitors only glimpse through carefully arranged tours. Their destination inside the sprawling castle complex was Queen Mary's doll's house and, later, the Royal Library. Both places are not typical stops during official state visits. That choice of itinerary said something about the personal touch Camilla wanted to add, offering Melania a chance to see artifacts that carry cultural rather than purely political weight. For Melania, who is often seen in the public eye for her fashion choices and her quiet presence alongside her husband, this moment gave her a different role. She was the guest of honor in a cultural exchange, where the emphasis was on heritage and art rather than statecraft. Camilla, now firmly established as queen consort after years in the public eye, appeared keen to highlight aspects of Britain's softer power, the treasures that are less about governance and more about legacy. These shared interests offered both women a neutral space to connect, away from the pressures of the political stage. Observers noted that the interaction between the two seemed warm but measured. There were smiles, polite conversation, and the kind of composure expected during such occasions. Yet the decision to take Melania into the doll's house carried symbolic resonance. Queen Mary's doll's house is not a toy in any ordinary sense. Built in the early 1920s, it is an elaborate miniature palace designed to showcase the very best of British craftsmanship. Every room was created to be a perfect scale replica, complete with running water, electricity, and thousands of tiny objects, from books to silverware, all painstakingly made by leading designers and artisans of the time. The house was meant to serve as both a work of art and a time capsule of Britain in the early 20th century. For Camilla to bring Melania here was to open a door into an intimate corner of royal heritage. At the start of the tour, guides explained the origins of the doll's house, how it had been a gift to Queen Mary, grandmother of the late Queen Elizabeth II, and how it had since become one of Windsor's most visited attractions. For many years, the house has fascinated not just children, but adults who marvel at the level of detail and the preservation of such a unique artifact. For Melania, the scale and precision would have been striking. As someone who has spent much of her public life in spaces defined by grandeur and excess, the delicate scale of this creation offered a different perspective on luxury. Here, the emphasis was not on size, but on meticulous craftsmanship. The presence of certain items inside the doll's house made the tour even more interesting. Among its most famous treasures are miniature books, many of them less than 2 inches tall, contributed by some of the greatest authors of the 20th century. These are not facsimiles, but original works written and bound specifically for the collection. One of the details that caught attention during Melania's visit was the inclusion of more recent contributions, such as a tiny book written by Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles. This blending of past and present, classic authors like Arthur Conan Doyle alongside contemporary voices tied directly to Camilla's family, added an unexpected personal touch. It was a reminder that the doll's house, while historic, is not frozen in time. It continues to evolve, with each generation adding to its story. Observers later remarked that Melania appeared visibly intrigued by the small volumes, carefully peering into the cases where they were displayed. There is something disarming about objects of such immense cultural weight, rendered in miniature, and it was here that the tone of the visit shifted slightly. What could have been a routine tour became a moment of quiet surprise. The shock, if one could call it that, lay in the discovery that these tiny creations were not just decorative, but meaningful. A book, no matter how small, carries a voice, and in this case, those voices spanned both history and personal connection. The visit to Windsor Castle was not only about artifacts, though. It was also about the optics of two women navigating a public moment together. Camilla, often viewed through the lens of her relationship with King Charles and her long journey to public acceptance, was playing the role of host and cultural ambassador. Melania, whose tenure as First Lady of the United States was marked by moments of both visibility and mystery, was positioned as a guest who could bridge the gap between American curiosity about the monarchy and British efforts to showcase its softer traditions. Together, they presented a scene of composure and shared appreciation, one that stood apart from the more contentious images that often accompany state visits. The symbolism did not go unnoticed. Windsor Castle is associated with continuity and resilience, having survived wars, fires, and political upheavals. To walk through its halls is to be reminded of the enduring presence of the monarchy. For Melania, whose own public role has been defined in part by her ability to navigate intense scrutiny with silence and reserve, there may have been a kind of resonance. The doll's house, with its hidden details and carefully preserved treasures, mirrored in some ways her own tendency to let small gestures speak louder than words. While cameras were limited during the tour itself, reports from those present emphasized the quiet focus with which Melania examined the displays. The surprise, the moment of shock suggested in later coverage, did not come from any dramatic revelation, but from the recognition of just how much meaning could be packed into such small objects. For an American audience, unfamiliar with the full extent of the doll's house's treasures, the idea that a collection of miniature books and artifacts could carry national significance may have seemed remarkable. For the British public, seeing Camilla share this moment underscored her role as custodian of heritage. When the doors to Queen Mary's doll's house opened, Melania Trump stepped into a world unlike any she had seen before. At first glance, it looked like something designed for children, an oversized playhouse with delicate proportions. But the more she looked, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary doll's house. It was a masterpiece, a monument to detail, and a striking symbol of the British monarchy's cultural legacy. The shock for her was not that it existed, but that it had been built and maintained with such extraordinary care for nearly a century. The doll's house was created in the early 1920s for Queen Mary, the wife of King George V. Designed by the architect Sir Edwin Lutyens, it was built as a perfect miniature palace, down to the finest details. Every room mirrored a real-life counterpart, fitted with electric lights, running water, and even working lifts. This was not meant to be a toy, but rather a demonstration of the best craftsmanship that Britain could produce at the time. Artists, writers, and craftsmen from across the country were asked to contribute, and the result was a collection that was part artwork, part archive, and part political statement. As Melania moved through the space with Queen Camilla, guides pointed out some of the most notable features. The house is fitted with over 1,500 miniature works, ranging from tiny bottles of wine to complete sets of silver cutlery. The shelves are lined with books so small that they can only be read with a magnifying glass. Yet inside those tiny covers are original contributions by some of the greatest literary minds of the 20th century. Among them are works by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, and J.M. Barrie. Each book is unique, written specifically for this collection, making the Doll's House one of the most unusual literary archives in the world. For Melania, this was more than a display of royal heritage. She was seeing a collection that blurred the line between art and history, where every detail was intentional and preserved with precision. One detail that drew attention was the inclusion of a miniature book written by Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles. This edition demonstrated that the tradition of contributing to the Doll's House is still alive today, linking the past to the present in a subtle but powerful way. Seeing something so personal tied to the Queen Consort's own family gave the exhibit a sense of intimacy that might not have been expected in such a formal setting. Observers noted how Melania leaned in closely to examine the tiny books and objects. There was a sense of surprise on her face, perhaps because the collection was both so playful and so serious at the same time. Here were objects that looked like toys, but were, in fact, repositories of culture. The craftsmanship alone was enough to impress. Every miniature book, every tiny piece of furniture, every bottle on the shelves had been made to scale with astonishing accuracy. The house itself, standing at nearly 3 feet tall, was a structure that could take hours to explore in detail. For someone encountering it for the first time, it was overwhelming. The shock, if one could call it that, came from the recognition of how much meaning had been packed into such a small space. In American culture, historical memory often takes the form of large monuments, wide landscapes, and towering statues. Here, history was preserved in miniature, in objects that required patience and attention to be appreciated. Melania's visit highlighted how these differences in cultural traditions can surprise even those accustomed to grandeur. What might have seemed like a quaint attraction from the outside turned out to be one of the most sophisticated cultural artifacts in the royal collection. The Doll's House also contains miniature artworks, many of them created by leading painters of the early 20th century. There are tiny oil paintings, watercolors, and sculptures, each crafted with the same care as their full-sized counterparts. For Camilla, who has long supported the arts, sharing this collection with Melania offered a way of emphasizing Britain's role as a patron of creativity across generations. For Melania, whose public profile has often been tied to aesthetics and presentation, there was an obvious connection. The craftsmanship, the design, and the artistic detail were all areas that resonated with her own background in fashion and style. One of the striking moments in the tour came when Melania was shown the Doll's House's library, which contains around 200 miniature books. Among them is a tiny edition of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, a story deeply tied to British cultural identity. Another miniature is a Beatrix Potter set that had once been admired by Queen Elizabeth II in her childhood. These books are not only rare, but symbolic. They represent continuity, the passing down of cultural treasures from one generation to another, in a form that is both playful and profound. For Melania, encountering them would have been a reminder of how literature and art shape identity, even when compressed into such small forms. There is also a certain irony in the Doll's House. Built as a demonstration of British modernity in the 1920s, it now stands as a reminder of a world that has largely disappeared. Many of the craftsmen who contributed their skills to its creation represented trades that no longer exist in the same way. The house is not only a piece of history, but also a record of lost traditions. That sense of time captured in miniature is part of what makes the exhibit so striking. For someone like Melania, stepping into that space meant stepping into a past that still speaks through detail. Throughout the tour, Queen Camilla appeared to take care in pointing out details and explaining the significance of certain objects. For her, the Doll's House is not only part of the royal collection, but also a personal passion. She has been known to enjoy its artistry and has spoken in the past about the importance of keeping such traditions alive. By sharing it with Melania, she was also offering a glimpse into the quieter, more cultural side of royal life, away from ceremonies and official duties. The reactions outside of Windsor Castle later reflected just how unusual this moment was. It is rare for visiting dignitaries, let alone a former First Lady of the United States, to be given a private tour of the doll's house. The decision to include it in the itinerary was a sign of the monarchy's desire to create a personal experience, one that might leave a lasting impression. For Melania, the impression was clear. The level of detail, the combination of history and artistry, and the unexpected personal touches made the experience memorable in a way that few state visits managed to achieve. After stepping away from the doll's house, the next stop for Melania Trump and Queen Camilla was the Royal Library at Windsor Castle. If the miniature palace had left Melania surprised with its charm and precision, the library offered a different kind of astonishment. Here, scale was not measured in tiny replicas, but in centuries of preserved history, stacked in shelves that stretched across the room, and filled with works that carried the voice of monarchs, poets, and leaders long gone. The Royal Library is not just a collection of books. It is one of the most significant repositories of British culture and heritage, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, maps, drawings, and printed works. Some of its treasures are rarely seen outside of the royal family or specialist scholars. For Melania, who had just explored objects that captured history in miniature, the library presented the opposite experience. History writ large, tangible in original documents that had survived wars, upheavals, and the passing of empires. One of the first items shown to her was a poem by Queen Elizabeth I. Written in her own hand, it carried the delicate penmanship of a woman who not only ruled England during a time of immense change, but also contributed to its cultural life as a writer and thinker. For anyone viewing the document, the sense of proximity to Elizabeth I was powerful. Here was a queen whose image is often frozen in portraits, suddenly made more human by seeing her words on paper. For Melania, standing in front of such an artifact must have been a moment of reflection, a reminder that leadership is not only about power, but also about the expression of thought and emotion. The library also presented an annotated copy of Shakespeare's Second Folio, owned by King Charles I. This was another item chosen carefully for its significance. The Second Folio, published in 1632, is one of the earliest collections of Shakespeare's plays. To see it marked with notes by a monarch who was later executed during the English Civil War was to glimpse a moment of deep historical drama. Charles III had turned to Shakespeare's words, perhaps for solace or inspiration, and in doing so left behind a physical record of his engagement with the plays. For Melania, this was less about the specifics of the notes and more about the intimacy of the act. Here was a king, known for his political struggles and tragic fate, revealed in the private act of reading and commenting. The contrast between the artifacts in the doll's house and those in the library could not have been greater. In the doll's house, objects were playful, tiny, and designed to delight. In the library, the objects were monumental, tied to power, conflict, and national identity. Yet both spaces shared a common purpose: to preserve stories and voices that might otherwise be forgotten. For Camilla, guiding Melania through these rooms was a way of demonstrating the breadth of Britain's cultural heritage, from the whimsical to the profound. Observers noted that Melania's attention in the library seemed particularly drawn to the books and manuscripts. She asked questions, leaned forward to look more closely at the handwriting, and seemed genuinely interested in the stories behind the artifacts. Unlike political briefings, which are often delivered in polished sound bites, these documents spoke in a direct and unfiltered voice from the past. A queen writing poetry, a king marking his thoughts in a Shakespearean text. These were reminders that history is made not only by public acts, but also by private expressions. The Royal Library also contains many scientific works, atlases, and drawings that map the changing understanding of the world over centuries. While not all of these were shown during the visit, the scope of the collection was emphasized. It holds works by Leonardo da Vinci, maps that chart the growth of the British Empire, and documents that shaped political decisions over centuries. For an American visitor, this depth of continuity can be striking. In the United States, where national history is relatively young, the idea of holding centuries of monarchs' personal manuscripts in one place carries a different weight. For Melania, the library may have highlighted the difference in scale between the histories of the two nations. Part of what makes the Royal Library so significant is its role not just as a storage space, but as a working collection. Scholars continue to study its contents, and the royal family itself occasionally draws on it for speeches, exhibitions, and public events. By including it in Melania's tour, Camilla was not just showing her a room of old books. She was opening a window into how the monarchy maintains its cultural memory, constantly looking back at the past to inform the present. The moment also carried symbolic weight for Camilla personally. As queen consort, she has taken on the responsibility of representing tradition while also modernizing the monarchy's image. By choosing to highlight the library, she underscored her interest in literature, history, and continuity. For Melania, who has often been seen as a reserved and private figure, the experience may have resonated on a personal level. The documents she was shown were themselves private in origin, letters, annotations, creative works that had only later become part of public history. The parallel between her own life, often scrutinized but rarely fully understood, and these glimpses of past monarchs' private thoughts would not have been hard to see. Later reports suggested that Melania appeared both impressed and thoughtful during the library visit. There were no dramatic gestures or comments, but her quiet focus told its own story. This was not simply about looking at objects. It was about confronting history in its rawest form, seeing the handwriting of figures she had previously only known through textbooks or popular culture. For a moment, the distance between past and present seemed to collapse, and the human side of monarchy became visible. The decision to show these particular items was deliberate. A poem by Elizabeth I and an annotated Shakespeare folio by Charles I are not just rare artifacts, they are symbols of resilience, creativity, and tragedy. Together, they told a story of the monarchy's highs and lows, of rulers who inspired and rulers who fell. In that sense, they mirrored the broader story of Windsor Castle itself, a place that has endured through fire, war, and political transformation. For Melania, walking through its library was like walking through layers of that history. Each artifact, another reminder of how the past continues to speak. The public response to the visit highlighted the uniqueness of the occasion. While political meetings between leaders are common, opportunities for spouses to engage with cultural treasures are less so. Melania's tour of the Royal Library was a moment where diplomacy met heritage. It was not about treaties or agreements, but about sharing stories, traditions, and values. It was soft diplomacy in its purest form, showing the strength of a nation not only in its institutions, but in its art and literature. By the time Melania Trump and Queen Camilla stepped out of Windsor Castle, the images of their joint tour were already circulating across news platforms and social media. Photographs captured the two women walking side by side, pausing to observe the doll's house and leaning in to examine delicate manuscripts in the Royal Library. It had been a rare moment of visibility for Melania during her husband's second state visit to Britain, and for Camilla, it was another step in shaping her identity as queen consort. The immediate reaction from the press was a mix of fascination and analysis. For many outlets, the choice of itinerary stood out. State visits usually feature formal dinners, meetings with government officials, and ceremonial welcomes. While those events had taken place, the private tour of Windsor Castle offered something different. It was a cultural showcase, a softer gesture that emphasized heritage and continuity rather than political negotiation. Journalists noted that Melania's expressions during the tour seemed genuine, reflecting curiosity and engagement rather than the reserve she is often associated with. Public response varied depending on perspective. In the United States, coverage focused largely on Melania herself. Observers commented on her poise, her quiet presence, and the contrast between her often guarded public image and the apparent fascination she displayed inside Windsor. For some, this was a reminder that her role as First Lady had often been misunderstood, defined more by speculation about her silence than by her actual actions. Her visit to Windsor suggested another side, one that was comfortable engaging with history and culture when given the chance. In Britain, the emphasis was on Camilla. Since becoming Queen Consort, she has taken on a higher public profile, balancing her role alongside King Charles III, while also carving out a space of her own. By inviting Melania to view the Doll's House and the Royal Library, she was seen as both a hostess and a cultural ambassador. It was a chance to highlight treasures that symbolize the monarchy's softer power, its ability to inspire through art, history, and tradition rather than politics. Commentators noted that Camilla appeared confident and comfortable in this role, guiding Melania with ease and sharing details about the exhibits. The symbolism of the visit resonated beyond the walls of Windsor. For supporters of the monarchy, it was an example of how the institution can adapt, finding ways to remain relevant in the 21st century. By focusing on cultural heritage, the monarchy reminded the public that its role is not only ceremonial, but also custodial, protecting and preserving objects that carry the nation's story. For critics, however, the event raised questions about the use of heritage as diplomacy. Some wondered whether such carefully curated tours risked becoming little more than public relations exercises, designed to distract from political realities. Yet even those critics acknowledged the power of the imagery. Two high-profile women standing in front of artifacts that had survived centuries, bridging the gap between nations in a way that speeches alone rarely achieve. The aftermath also sparked conversations about the contrast between the two women. Melania, a former model who has often chosen to stay away from public commentary, and Camilla, who endured decades of scrutiny before taking on the role of Queen Consort, represent different paths into the spotlight. Both have been defined, in part, by their relationships with powerful men, yet both also carry their own identities shaped by experience, resilience, and public perception. The Windsor visit highlighted those parallels without ever needing to state them outright. Observers noted that Melania's encounter with the Doll's House seemed to strike a personal chord. The precision, the craftsmanship, and the hidden details may have resonated with her own appreciation for design and aesthetics. In contrast, the Royal Library spoke to themes of history, power, and endurance, concepts that have long been associated with the monarchy, but also carry relevance in a broader human sense. The combination of both visits created a narrative arc, from the playful surprises of the miniature palace to the profound weight of centuries-old manuscripts. For Melania, the impression appeared to be lasting. What was equally notable was the public silence that followed. Neither Melania nor Camilla gave detailed public statements about the visit. Instead, the story was told through images, brief remarks, and the analysis of those who observed from the outside. In some ways, that silence added to the intrigue. When public figures refrain from over-explaining, the interpretation is left to the audience. And in this case, the audience saw a moment of genuine cultural exchange. The visit also reinforced the idea that diplomacy does not always need to be formal or overt. Soft diplomacy, the use of culture, heritage, and shared experiences to build relationships, is often more effective in leaving a lasting impression. The Doll's House and the Royal Library may not solve political disagreements, but they create common ground, reminding visitors of the universality of storytelling, creativity, and memory. For Melania, walking through those halls offered her not only a glimpse into Britain's history, but also an opportunity to reflect on her own place in the public eye. From a broader perspective, the Windsor tour became part of the narrative of Donald Trump's state visit. While political analysts dissected his meetings and speeches, cultural commentators focused on Melania's time with Camilla. This division of focus was telling. It showed how state visits are multi-layered, with different aspects appealing to different audiences. For the public, the cultural exchanges often linger longer in memory than the policy discussions. Photographs of Melania leaning over the doll's house or examining a centuries-old manuscript carried an accessibility that official statements rarely achieve. In the weeks that followed, articles continued to revisit the visit, drawing connections between past and present. Some writers reflected on Queen Mary's intention when commissioning the doll's house in the 1920s, noting how it was designed as a showcase of Britain's best craftsmanship. Others drew attention to Elizabeth I's poem and Charles I's annotated Shakespeare folio, seeing in them reminders of how fragile and resilient leadership can be. These connections underscored the richness of what Melania had been shown. It was not a random selection of objects, but a carefully curated narrative about continuity, creativity, and the endurance of history. For Camilla, the success of the visit reinforced her position as a cultural guide. Her role as queen consort has required her to balance tradition with modern expectation, and moments like this helped shape her public image as someone who values history not only as ceremony, but as substance. Sharing the doll's house and the royal library was more than hospitality. It was a statement about the monarchy's ongoing role in safeguarding the nation's cultural memory. For Melania, the experience added another layer to her international profile. Though often portrayed as distant or detached, her time at Windsor showed her as attentive, curious, and engaged. In an era where images define much of public perception, those subtle shifts mattered. They suggested that her presence on the world stage continues to be shaped not only by politics, but also by cultural encounters. Ultimately, the Windsor Castle tour highlighted how heritage can bridge divides. It did not erase political tensions, nor did it change the course of policy, but it offered a reminder that the threads of history, art, and culture weave connections that transcend immediate disagreements. The doll's house and the royal library may seem like static displays, but in moments like this, they become active participants in diplomacy, shaping how visitors see not only Britain but themselves. By the end of the day, as the castle returned to its usual rhythm and the media moved on to other headlines, what remained was the image of two women in a quiet conversation, surrounded by objects that told stories spanning centuries. That image, simple as it seemed, carried weight. It spoke of the monarchy's ability to surprise, of the value of heritage in a modern world, and of the way shared experiences can leave lasting impressions. For Melania, it was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments are not scripted speeches, but silent encounters with history. For Camilla, it was proof that the past, when shared thoughtfully, still has the power to shock, to inspire, and to connect.